Hey, what is up everybody? This is Blackblade and welcome back to Blackblade's Backlog Babble, the show that goes so fast, the explanation's in the video description. Let's go! The problem with getting into fighting games after they've already been out for several years is, if you really get into them, you don't have anybody to play it against. That's okay though, because I still had a great time with Injustice. Traditional style fighting games are a genre I've only ever played with friends, but as a first choice for one to play single player, this was a good pick I think. Part of the reason for that is, of all the Marvel or DC games I've played to date, this one is the most comic booky in its narrative structure, and I absolutely loved it. It made the story pretty easy to follow. On Earth 2, the Joker tricks Superman into killing Lois Lane and nuking Metropolis, and in turn he snaps, killing the Joker and implementing an authoritarian regime of metahumans known as the One Earth government. 5 years later, the last insurgents, Batman and Lex Luthor, call heroes from Earth 27 in the midst of stopping a similar conflict to aid them in taking down Superman for good. Even saying that out loud is enough to confuse me, but the impressive thing is that this game takes a plot with a complicated setup and makes it both simple and super easy to follow. Even with look-alike Batman standing next to each other, I never got lost from who's who and where who is and why who does what when. Also, the characterization in general is pretty great. As with any good comic book character, they can alternate between lovably campy and stoic at the drop of a hat. There honestly wasn't a single character I thought was poorly executed. Even Green Arrow, who at first I was split on, ended up redeeming himself for me by the end. And related to the characters, we can move on to the fighting mechanics, and I must say I had an absolute blast with them. I could tell this game is from NetherRealm even without the Splash logo just because of how similar it feels to what little I have played of the newer Mortal Kombat games. Now I will admit firsthand that I probably did not do a very good job at this game. As I've only played the story mode at the time of making this video, I never took the opportunity to get properly acquainted with key set combos characters had or the whole wager mechanic. Rather, I got through most of the game using my Smash Brothers mentality of chaining together individual moves as best I could and spending way too much time in the air. At first I blamed the tutorial, but the more I thought about it, I realized it's likely my personal experience with the genre holding me back. Of the 11 characters I got to play in the story mode though, I have to say without question my favorite was Deathstroke. There was something about the blend between CQC, swordsmanship, and marksmanship in a package where you can feel the weight of your attacks, and next to Superman and Wonder Woman was the character I saw the most difference come from powering up moves. Something just clicked for me when playing as him, making him one of the few characters I didn't lose a single fight as. If I was around to get into this game when it had an active community, this would likely be the character I first jumped into PvP matches with. Another point is that I think the story mode is just the right length. I feel any longer and it would have grown stale or padded out, so this is one of the few times I think a game being roughly 4 hours to finish is completely acceptable. Having an engaging story with the fights fun and addicting is enough for me. I will say though, I didn't get much out of this game's general presentation. The art style isn't bad, but it did feel more like a game that came out in 2008 with a lot of the facial models and stuff. The bigger problem for me though is that of the 10 most recent first playthroughs I've done for games, this soundtrack was easily the most unimpactful. The previous 9 all had at least one track I can remember or stood out to me, but this one didn't really have that. As that's not what I focused on or really cared about, it didn't hinder my experience. While I'm hesitant to use potentially hyperbolic statements this early into making these kinds of videos, Injustice is quite possibly the most fun I've had with a DC game yet. It's a game I see myself putting on to pass the time trying all the other single-player features offered, and if anyone with an Xbox who's willing to humor a newcomer in a 7-year-old game would like to play a few rounds, let me know. Until then though, for the story mode alone, I'd most definitely consider this game worth the wait. Seeing as this campaign is split into 2 separate parts, I'm going to first share my thoughts immediately after playing Leon's campaign, and then pick up after finishing Claire's. So without further ado, here we go. Resident Evil 2 is the first game to look so visually spectacular that I was genuinely disgusted by a burger. This was a game that came out at an interesting time, both shortly after I completed my first ever Resident Evil game, 4, and during the time I was making a video praising Capcom for another title and closely observing how bombastic of an opening they had in 2019. My interest peaked when it seemed to most viewers this was the desired Game of the Year pick for TGA 2019, and while I admittedly will say say I enjoyed Sekiro a touch more. After playing it, I can see why. Resident Evil 2 is a remake that I will not be comparing to the original as I've never played it, nor really seen anything about it. As a first-time experience, coming from someone not too experienced with true survival horror games, this was absolutely fantastic. Though as a newcomer that wanted to play on normal difficulty, it had a few struggles to get past in order to fully appreciate. In the first campaign I played, you take the role of Leon, a promising up-and-comer who has just joined the Raccoon City Police Department. However, in arriving at the city, he finds it infested with zombies. After being forced to split up with his newfound comrade Claire, he reaches the police department and has to use his knowledge and resources to save the city as best he can. Let's start with the things I liked from the very beginning though. The engine for this game is stunning, very lifelike and colorful with great lighting, but still appropriately atmospheric. The art direction here works wonders as from offices, libraries, sewers, high-tech facilities, and just regular stores, everything has an uncomfortable vibe offering a permanent sense of dread. As you may have noticed from how many different kinds of places I named off, there's also a stark variety to the environments you experience, more so than you might expect. I could never wait to see the next place the game had in store for me, yet at the same time was always unsettled to go forwards because I didn't want to die a horrific and ugly death. Speaking of that, this game is very intense and hits a proper level of challenge. I never felt safe, but the game made me astute to that from the get-go, and I was much more careful going forward than I may otherwise be. However, one issue that isn't a problem with the game so much as my lack of experience is ammo conservation. I knew unlike Resident Evil 4 that would actually be a predicament here, but I didn't know to what extent. Also, with the games I'm accustomed to playing, I often found myself fighting things on instinct and realizing I had just wasted time and resources fighting it. It made sections of the game frustrating to say the least, and it wasn't until the last couple of hours that I really had the whole conservation thing properly down. On the subject of things I think in practice are really good, but I struggled with due to my inexperience, is the design. This game has a lot of puzzle solving and backtracking, and as a fan of the Metroid Prime trilogy, I've got plenty of experience with both under my belt. As well as an appreciation for it I know some don't have. I like how areas end up reconnecting and certain progress bars are shown to you at an early point, allowing you to have it in the back of your mind until you come to it at a later time. My problem was that there were points I had way too much trouble figuring out how to proceed. Sometimes that was just not being able to figure out what to do next. Sometimes it was being in an area where something I needed was, but just not seeing it the first time. Both of those are okay, but there's one thing in particular that held me back for almost an hour and really got under my skin. Key item examination. Maybe I'm just unobservant and the game told me about this but I didn't notice, yet I had no idea until getting to the jail section in the game that you could interact with certain key items to turn them into separate key items. And sometimes you had to do that multiple times on the same one. This isn't bad game design, but my experience did suffer in getting frustrated from taking so long only to figure out the answer, as well as the answer to a couple other roadblocks I had, was all down to a game mechanic I didn't even know existed. Moving on, one mechanic I absolutely loved is Tyrant, Mr. X, the big baddie that constantly appears throughout the campaign to give you a heartache and make your day a million times more difficult. I love the way this guy was handled. As an encounter, you are simply incapable of standing up against and have to use the area to circumvent. All in all, a great way to keep the game's tension flowing. As a last thing to touch on, I'm going to be vague about the specifics because even with this series I'll try not to spoil much, but man, that last hour was the most intense and, dare I say, epic experience I've had in a video game for the past year. All the elements the game had been leading up to coming together in an explosive finale that gave you a brief surge in power compared to most of the game. Woo, I loved it. And now for added thoughts on Claire's campaign. I am now convinced this game is a near masterpiece. I wasn't sure playing the other campaign would change my mind much, but going through it with better understanding of the mechanics made it so much smoother and I felt much more capable. To give an idea, in Leon's campaign I probably died about 20 times, whereas in Claire's, only 3. Also, the way that the set pieces for Claire follow a familiar format but slightly change up the solutions was awesome. What I liked even more, however, is the weapons Claire gets as opposed to Leon's. Leon's weapon sandbox was fun to use, but Claire's grenade launcher was the most fun weapon to use in the entire game for me. Narratively, I enjoyed the addition of Sherry, and that it was interesting to have the focus on Mr. X set aside for more time and characterization of the Birkins, even though personally I found Tyrant more interesting than the G-Virus. I will say though that Leon has a more satisfying development, as the reason he was headed to Raccoon City in the first place follows through in getting to protect it during a time of need. I don't recall Claire ever getting payoff in searching for her brother Chris other than the strange note in the STARS office. Still, I was hooked and wanted to see both Claire and Sherry make it out of this. Resident Evil 2 is a game that brought me back to the days of obsessing over whatever new game I was playing that had me completely enthralled. Initially, of the games I've talked about in the series, this was the one I was most unsure of, but by the end, not only is it my favorite so far, but it may very well be a new addition to my favorite games, period. Beyond my highest expectations, this game was worth the wait. Thank you all for watching and for the support on the first video. I know this is a jarring transition with focusing more on this type of content as of late, but from what I've heard, it's been an enjoyable format, and I like making these videos a lot, so I'm gonna keep going. Slice that like button in half, subscribe to my channel if you are new, take care, and have fun.